The morning sun cast long shadows across Memorial Plaza as hundreds of people gathered for the annual Veterans Day ceremony. Families stood together, children waved small American flags, and veterans wore their service caps with quiet pride. It was supposed to be a peaceful day of remembrance and gratitude. Near the front of the crowd, an elderly man stood alone in a faded military jacket. His name was Robert Chen, and at 78 years old he carried himself with a certain dignity despite his worn appearance. His jacket had seen better days, with patches covering tears and the olive-green fabric faded from years of wear. His gray hair needed a trim, and his weathered face told stories of a life fully lived. Robert had arrived early, finding a spot where he could see the memorial stage clearly. As more people filled in around him, he began noticing details that others might miss. A younger man standing nearby wore a unit patch on his jacket, the same unit Robert had served with decades ago. Unable to contain his recognition, Robert leaned over and quietly mentioned it. "I served with that unit," he said softly, pointing to the patch. "2nd Battalion. Were you with them?" The younger man seemed surprised but nodded. Robert's face lit up and he began sharing a memory from his service days. His voice was gentle, almost reverent, as he spoke about the men he'd known and the experiences they'd shared. To Robert, this was what the day was about: connection, memory, and honoring those who'd served together. But not everyone saw it that way. A woman standing behind Robert shifted uncomfortably. She whispered to her husband that the old man was bothering people. Another person nearby misunderstood Robert's quiet conversation, thinking he was asking for something. Within minutes, several attendees had approached the security team with complaints about a man near the front who was causing a disturbance. The head of security that day was a man named David Williams. He took his job seriously, perhaps too seriously at times. When multiple complaints came in about the same person, David knew he had to act. The mayor was about to speak and the ceremony needed to proceed smoothly. He signaled to another guard, and together they made their way through the crowd toward the front. Robert didn't notice them approaching at first. He was lost in a memory, explaining to the man with the unit patch about a particular mission that had changed his life. His hands moved as he spoke, illustrating something only he could see in his mind's eye. "Excuse me, sir," David said, touching Robert's shoulder gently. Robert turned, confusion crossing his weathered face. "Yes? We've received some complaints," David explained, keeping his voice low to avoid making a scene. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave the ceremony." Robert's eyes widened. "Complaints? I was just talking about the old days. I served with his unit, you see." "I understand, sir," David interrupted, though his tone suggested he really didn't. "But we need to keep things orderly for the ceremony. If you could please come with us." The confusion on Robert's face deepened into something sadder. He looked down at his jacket, suddenly aware of how shabby he must appear. His hands, which had been animated moments before, now hung at his sides. They trembled slightly. Whether from age or emotion, it was hard to tell. "I just wanted to pay my respects," Robert said quietly. "I have every right to be here." "Sir, please don't make this difficult," the second security guard added. "We can do this quietly, or we can make it official." Robert took a deep breath and nodded. He wouldn't cause trouble. That wasn't his way. He'd faced far worse than being asked to leave a public ceremony, though somehow this stung in a different way. He began to walk with the security guards toward the edge of the plaza. As they moved through the crowd, a few people started to notice. A young woman near the aisle pulled out her phone and began recording. "Are they seriously removing a veteran?" she whispered to her friend. The image on her screen showed two security guards flanking an elderly man in a military jacket, escorting him away from a Veterans Day ceremony. The irony wasn't lost on anyone watching. More heads began to turn. The quiet murmur of the crowd grew slightly louder. On the stage, the mayor had just begun his prepared speech about honoring those who had served their country. Completely unaware of what was happening, just yards away from him, "We gather here today to show our gratitude to the brave men and women who answered their country's call." The mayor's voice boomed through the speakers, but fewer people were listening now. More were watching the scene unfolding near the front. Robert walked with his head held high, maintaining his dignity even as he was being removed. He didn't argue or resist. He simply walked, flanked by the two guards who were just doing their jobs. An elderly man in the crowd wearing a World War II veteran cap struggled to his feet with the help of his cane. He squinted toward Robert, his eyes widening in recognition. His mouth opened, then closed, then opened again as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The guard's hand remained on Robert's elbow as they reached the edge of the crowd. In just a few more steps, he would be escorted off the plaza entirely, removed from a ceremony meant to honor people exactly like him. That's when the elderly veteran with the cane finally found his voice. "Wait," he shouted loud enough to carry over the mayor's speech. "Do you have any idea who that man is?" Everything stopped. The mayor paused mid-sentence. David's hand froze on Robert's arm. The entire crowd turned to look. In that moment of sudden silence, everything was about to change. The word "wait" echoed across Memorial Plaza like a thunderclap. Every conversation stopped. Every phone that had been recording the mayor's speech suddenly turned toward the commotion. Even the pigeons that had been pecking at crumbs near the fountain seemed to pause. David's grip on Robert's elbow loosened, but didn't let go completely. He turned to see who had shouted, his face showing a mixture of annoyance and uncertainty. This was not how the ceremony was supposed to go. The elderly man with the cane was making his way forward, pushing through the crowd with surprising determination for someone who looked to be in his late 80s. His World War II veteran cap sat slightly crooked on his white hair, and his hands shook as he gripped his wooden cane. But his eyes were locked on Robert with an intensity that made people step aside. "Do you have any idea who that man is?" he repeated, his voice cracking with emotion. The mayor had stopped speaking entirely now. He stood at the podium, microphone in hand, looking confused and increasingly concerned. His prepared speech about honoring veterans suddenly felt hollow in light of whatever was unfolding before him. Robert stood frozen, his face a mixture of confusion and something else. Recognition, perhaps. His eyes met those of the old man approaching him, and for a moment time seemed to stop. 50 years fell away in an instant. "Colonel Thornton." Robert's voice was barely a whisper, but in the sudden silence of the plaza, it carried. The old man nodded, tears already streaming down his weathered cheeks. "It's me, sir. Jimmy Thornton. I served under you in '68. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. The young woman who had been recording caught every second of it, her phone's camera shaking slightly in her trembling hands. She didn't know the full story yet, but she knew she was witnessing something important. David finally released Robert's arm completely, stepping back with a growing sense that he had made a terrible mistake. His fellow security guard looked equally uncomfortable, both men suddenly wishing they could disappear into the crowd. Colonel Thornton reached Robert and, despite his age and the cane, straightened up as much as his old bones would allow. He lifted his right hand in a crisp military salute, holding it there as tears continued to fall. "Captain Robert Chen," he said, his voice now stronger, carrying across the silent plaza. "Medal of Honor recipient. Vietnam War. You could have heard a pin drop. Medal of Honor." Those 3 words hung in the air like a revelation. People who had been watching casually suddenly stood straighter. Veterans in the crowd removed their caps. Parents pulled their children closer, wanting them to witness this moment. The mayor's face had gone completely pale. His speechwriter, standing off to the side of the stage, looked like she might be sick. They had been seconds away from having a Medal of Honor recipient forcibly removed from a Veterans Day ceremony. The political nightmare of that scenario was just beginning to dawn on everyone involved. Robert slowly raised his own hand and returned the salute, though his hand shook more than it had before. "At ease, Colonel," he said softly. "It's been a long time." The 2 men dropped their salutes and embraced, 2 old soldiers meeting after decades apart. Colonel Thornton's cane fell to the ground, forgotten, as he held on to Robert like a lifeline. "You saved my life," he said, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "You saved all of us. You, City 68. You threw yourself at that machine gun nest. 23 men would have died if not for you." The crowd was pressing closer now, everyone wanting to hear, to understand. The young woman with the phone had been joined by dozens of others, all recording, all capturing this unexpected moment of truth. "You were captured," Colonel Thornton continued, his voice breaking. 6 months in that prison camp. We thought you were dead. When you finally came home, you had nothing left to prove to anyone. You were a hero, sir. You are a hero." Robert shook his head slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. "I just did what anyone would have done," he said, the standard response of men who had done extraordinary things. No, Colonel Thornton said firmly. Not anyone. You. Another veteran pushed through the crowd, this one younger, maybe in his 60s. He wore a Vietnam veteran cap and carried himself with the careful posture of someone dealing with old injuries. Captain Chen? He asked, his voice uncertain. When Robert turned to look at him, the man's face crumbled. Sir, it's Frank Rodriguez. I was with Charlie Company. You pulled me out of that river when I took shrapnel. I never got to thank you properly. Now it was Robert's turn to show emotion. His weathered face, which had maintained such dignity even while being escorted out, finally broke. Tears welled in his eyes as he reached out to shake Frank's hand. Rodriguez, I remember. You made it home. Because of you, sir. Because of you. The mayor had left the podium now and was making his way down the steps, his prepared speech completely forgotten. His aide tried to hand him a bottle of water, but he waved it away, his focus entirely on the scene unfolding before him. Frank Rodriguez turned to address the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak. This man, he said, gesturing to Robert, has been living in his car for the past 6 months. His wife passed away last year and the medical bills took everything. Everything. He lost his home, his savings, all of it. The crowd's shock turned to something else now. Anger, perhaps. Shame, certainly. Here stood a man who had given everything for his country, who had literally thrown himself in harm's way to save others, and he had been sleeping in his car, and they had been about to throw him out of a ceremony meant to honor him. He comes to the VA clinic where I volunteer, Frank continued. He's too proud to ask for help. Too proud to tell anyone who he really is or what he did. I've been trying to get him into housing for months, but the waiting lists are so long. David, the security supervisor, stood off to the side, his face in his hands. His shoulders shook slightly. He was a veteran himself, Iraq War, and the weight of what he had almost done was crushing him. Robert tried to speak, to explain, but his voice failed him. He had come to the ceremony just to be around other veterans, to share stories, to remember. He hadn't wanted any of this attention. He never did. The mayor finally reached them, his political instincts warring with genuine horror at what had almost happened. Whatever he had planned to say died on his lips when he saw Robert up close, saw the faded Medal of Honor on his worn jacket, saw the tears on this old hero's face, sir, the mayor said, and his voice actually shook. I am so deeply sorry. But sorry wasn't going to be enough. Everyone there knew it. The phones kept recording, and the story was already spreading beyond the plaza, beyond the city, racing across the internet at the speed of outrage and shame. Something had to change. Something had to be done. And everyone present, from the mayor to the veterans to the families with their small flags, knew that this moment would demand more than just an apology. This was just the beginning. The mayor stood there, his mouth opening and closing like he was trying to find words that didn't exist. Behind him, his entire staff looked equally lost. How do you apologize for something like this? How do you make it right when you've almost thrown a war hero out of his own ceremony? But before the mayor could stumble through whatever speech he was trying to form, someone else stepped forward. A woman in her 50s wearing a business suit and holding a tablet pushed through the crowd with purpose. She was crying, not bothering to wipe away the tears streaming down her face. Captain Chen, she said, her voice shaking. You don't know me, but you knew my father. Lieutenant Danny Morrison. He served under you at Hugh City. Robert's eyes widened. Morrison. Yes, I remember him. Good man. One of the best. He died 3 years ago, she said, her voice breaking. Cancer. But before he passed, he told me stories. He told me about the day you saved his life. He said he watched you charge that machine gun position, knowing you probably wouldn't make it. He said you gave him 40 more years of life that day. 40 years to marry my mother, to raise 3 kids, to meet his grandchildren, all because of you. She reached into her purse and pulled out an old faded photograph. It showed a group of young soldiers, their arms around each other, all of them smiling despite the mud and exhaustion evident on their faces. She pointed to a young man in the center. That's my dad. And that's you next to him. Robert took the photograph with trembling hands. For a moment he was back there, young again, surrounded by his men, brothers who had depended on him, men he had fought beside, bled beside, some who had made it home and some who hadn't. He wanted me to find you, the woman continued. Before he died, he made me promise. He said if I ever had the chance to thank you, I should, but I couldn't find you. I tried, but I couldn't find you. I've been off the grid for a while. Robert said quietly, still staring at the photograph. After my wife died, I sort of disappeared. Didn't want to be a burden to anyone. Frank Rodriguez stepped forward again, his expression a mixture of frustration and sadness. That's exactly the problem, sir. You've been invisible, and our system lets veterans like you become invisible. Do you know how many people here had no idea who you were? How many of us walk past heroes every single day without knowing it? He turned to address the crowd, his voice rising with passion. This man sacrificed everything. And I mean everything. He spent 6 months in a prisoner of war camp being tortured because he wouldn't give up information about his unit. When he finally came home, he had injuries that still bother him today. Shrapnel still in his back, hearing damaged from explosions. And you know what the system gave him? A medal and a thank you. Then it forgot about him. The crowd was absolutely silent. Some people were nodding, others were crying. Veterans in the audience stood a little straighter, recognizing their own struggles in Frank's words. When his wife got cancer 2 years ago, Frank continued, he sold everything to pay for her treatment. His house, his car, his savings, everything, because the coverage wasn't enough. It's never enough. And when she passed away last year, he had nothing left. He's been living out of a 20-year-old sedan, parking in different places each night so nobody notices. Coming to the VA for meals because otherwise he might not eat that day. A man in the crowd wearing an expensive suit pushed forward. He owned several businesses in town. Everyone knew him. Wait, he said, his face pale. I saw you last week. In the parking lot behind my restaurant. I almost called the police because I thought you were loitering. Robert nodded slowly. I remember. You told me to move along, I did. No hard feelings. No hard feelings? The businessman repeated, his voice cracking. Sir, I almost had you arrested. A Medal of Honor recipient. And I almost had you arrested for having nowhere to sleep. The shame in the plaza was thick enough to cut with a knife. The mayor had finally found his voice, but it was small and uncertain. Captain Chen, I want you to know that the city will do everything in its power to make this right. We'll work with the VA, we'll find you housing, With respect, Mr. Mayor, interrupted Colonel Thornton, leaning heavily on his cane again after someone had retrieved it for him. We've heard promises before. Every Veterans Day, every Memorial Day, politicians stand up and talk about honoring those who served. But where's the honor in letting a Medal of Honor recipient sleep in his car? Where's the honor in that? The mayor's face flushed red, but he couldn't argue. The old colonel was right, and everyone there knew it. A young man in the crowd, maybe in his 20s, raised his hand like he was in school. I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but can someone explain something to me? What exactly is the Medal of Honor? I've heard of it, but I don't really know what it means. An older veteran next to him answered, his voice reverent. Son, the Medal of Honor is the highest military decoration awarded by the United States. It's given for personal acts of valor above and beyond the call of duty. Most of the people who earn it don't live to receive it. It's that dangerous what they do to earn it. Captain Chen didn't just risk his life. He threw it away, fully expecting to die to save his men. That's what it means. The young man looked at Robert with new eyes, with awe and respect. And he's been living in his car? For 6 months, Frank confirmed. That's messed up, the young man said, shaking his head. That's really messed up. His simple words seemed to capture what everyone was feeling. The young woman who had been recording the whole thing was crying now, still holding up her phone. Her video had already been shared thousands of times, the numbers climbing every second. Comments were pouring in from all over the country, all expressing the same shock and outrage. Robert looked overwhelmed by all the attention. He had come to the plaza just to quietly observe the ceremony, to feel connected to something again. Now hundreds of people were staring at him, discussing him, making plans for him. It was too much. I appreciate all this, he said, his voice barely audible, but I didn't come here for help. I came here because today is about remembering. It's about honoring the ones who didn't make it home, the ones who should be standing here instead of me. But you are here, said Morrison's daughter, taking his hand. And you matter. Your life matters. What happened to you matters. The mayor stepped closer, and this time when he spoke, he sounded less like a politician and more like a human being. Captain Chen, I can't undo what almost happened here today. I can't take back the fact that you were about to be removed from a ceremony held in honor of people like you. But I can promise you that this city will not forget you again. Not ever again. Robert looked at him, searching his face for sincerity. After a long moment, he nodded. Actions speak louder than words, Mr. Mayor. I've heard a lot of words in my life. Then let me show you actions, the mayor replied. Starting right now, he turned to his staff. Cancel the rest of my schedule today. All of it. We're going to fix this. The crowd erupted in applause, but Robert just stood there, still holding that old photograph of him and his men, looking like a man who had been lost for a very long time and was just beginning to find his way home. What happened next caught everyone off guard, including Robert himself. The businessman who had almost called the police on him stepped forward again, this time with determination in his eyes instead of shame. Captain Chen, he said, pulling out his phone. I own the apartment building on 5th Street. The one with the brick facade. I have a vacant 2-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor. It's yours, rent-free, for as long as you need it. Robert opened his mouth to protest, but the businessman held up his hand. Please, sir, let me do this. I need to do this. You shouldn't have to think twice about where you're sleeping tonight or any night. Before Robert could respond, a woman from the crowd called out. I run the medical clinic on Maple Avenue. Captain Chen, you come see us anytime. All your health care, medications, checkups, everything. No charge ever, another voice joined in. I own Tony's Diner downtown. You eat there whenever you want. Breakfast, lunch, dinner. On the house. My auto shop will service your vehicle, someone else shouted. Keep it running as long as you need it. The offers kept coming one after another, people stepping forward to contribute what they could. A barber offered free haircuts for life. A clothing store owner promised a new wardrobe. The owner of a local gym offered a lifetime membership. It was like watching a dam break, all the goodwill that had been building up suddenly flooding out at once. Robert stood in the middle of it all, completely overwhelmed. His hands were shaking more now, and his eyes were wet with tears he no longer tried to hide. I don't know what to say, he managed. This is too much. I can't accept all this. Yes, you can, Colonel Thornton said firmly, putting a hand on Robert's shoulder. You've spent your whole life giving. Now it's time to receive. Let people help you. That's an order, Captain. Despite everything, Robert actually smiled at that. You can't give me orders anymore, Colonel. You outrank me now. Then I'm asking as a friend, the old colonel said softly. Let us help you. The mayor had been on his phone speaking rapidly to someone. He ended the call and addressed Robert directly. Captain Chen, I just spoke with the director of the VA. We're expediting every benefit you're entitled to. Housing assistance, health care, pension adjustments, everything. She's personally overseeing your case as of right now, and the city is establishing an emergency fund specifically for veterans in crisis. You won't be the last person we help. Frank Rodriguez nodded approvingly. That's a good start, Mr. Mayor. But what about the other veterans sleeping in cars tonight? The ones who don't have Medal of Honors? The ones nobody recognizes? The mayor looked uncomfortable but not defensive. You're right. This can't be just about one person, no matter how deserving. We need systemic change. I'm committing to a full review of how this city serves its veterans, and I'm going to need help from people like you to make sure we get it right. I'll hold you to that, Frank said. We all will. The young woman who had been recording everything lowered her phone for a moment. Her hands were cramping from holding it up for so long, but she didn't care. This video has been shared over 100,000 times already, she announced to the crowd. People from all over the country are watching. They're asking how they can help. Robert looked alarmed at that. I don't want to be famous. I just want to live quietly. I understand, sir, the young woman said gently, but your story matters. Not because you want attention, but because it shows what's broken, and maybe, just maybe, your story can help fix it for others. Morrison's daughter, still holding the old photograph, spoke up. My father always said you were the most humble man he'd ever met. He said you never wanted recognition for what you did. But Captain Chen, sometimes being humble means accepting help when it's offered. It means letting people do for you what you've done for so many others. David, the security supervisor who had tried to escort Robert out, had been standing off to the side, barely able to look at anyone. Now he slowly approached, his face showing the internal struggle he'd been having. When he reached Robert, he stood at attention and saluted. Sir, I'm David Williams. I served in Iraq 2 tours. I came home and I became so focused on following rules and protocols that I forgot the human being part of the job. I almost removed you from this ceremony. I almost became part of the problem instead of part of the solution. Robert returned the salute, then extended his hand. You were doing your job, son. No one's perfect. The question is what you do next. David shook his hand, his relief visible. I want to volunteer, sir. At the VA, at shelters, wherever I can help other veterans. I can't change what I almost did today, but I can make sure I do better going forward. That's all any of us can do, Robert said quietly. Learn and do better. The crowd had grown even larger now. News of what was happening had spread through the city, and more people kept arriving. Local news crews were setting up cameras. The story was getting bigger by the minute, spreading far beyond the boundaries of Memorial Plaza. An elderly woman pushed through to the front, leaning heavily on a walker. She wore a gold star pin on her jacket, marking her as a mother who had lost a child in military service. "My son died in Afghanistan," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. He was 23 years old. He believed in service. He believed in sacrifice. If he were here today, he would be appalled at how we've treated you, Captain Chen. But he would also be proud of what's happening right now. People coming together. People caring. Robert's composure finally broke completely. He had held it together through everything else, but this woman's words, spoken with such grace despite her own loss, undid him. The tears came freely now, and he didn't try to stop them. "I'm sorry about your son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Every life lost is a life that mattered. That should have been lived." "They all matter," she agreed, "including yours. Your life matters too, Captain. Don't forget that." The businessman with the apartment stepped forward again. "Captain Chen, I've got keys to that unit in my office. It's furnished, utilities are on, it's ready right now. What do you say we go get you settled in today?" Robert looked around at all the faces surrounding him. Strangers who had become allies. People who had gone from ignoring him to embracing him. It was almost too much to process. His entire world had shifted in the space of an hour. "I still can't believe this is happening," he said softly. "Believe it," Colonel Thornton said. "This is what happens when people remember what really matters, when they stop and actually see each other." The mayor stepped up to the podium again, and this time the microphone was there for a different purpose. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying across the plaza and beyond, "to the phones recording, to the news cameras, to the world watching. Today didn't go as planned, but maybe it went exactly as it needed to. Captain Robert Chen reminded us all what service really means, and he reminded us of our obligation to serve those who served us." He gestured for Robert to join him on the stage. Robert hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the spotlight, but gentle hands from the crowd encouraged him forward. He climbed the steps slowly, his old knees protesting until he stood next to the mayor. The applause started then, a thunderous wave of sound that rolled across the plaza and seemed to go on forever. People weren't just clapping. They were standing, cheering, some with tears streaming down their faces. This was more than appreciation. This was acknowledgement. This was finally seeing someone who had been invisible for too long. Robert stood there, uncomfortable but unable to escape, and slowly, tentatively, he raised his hand in a small wave. The crowd roared even louder. This was their hero. This was their reminder. This was their wake-up call. 6 months later, the changes were impossible to ignore. Memorial Plaza looked different now, not physically but in the way people used it. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, veterans gathered there not for ceremonies but for coffee and conversation. Frank Rodriguez had organized it, calling it the No Veteran Left Behind meetup. What started with a dozen people had grown to over 100. Robert sat at one of the picnic tables, a real cup of coffee in his hands instead of the gas station stuff he used to get when he could afford it. He had filled out a bit, his face less hollow, his eyes clearer. The apartment the businessman had given him had become a real home, filled with photographs and memories of his late. "Captain Chen," a young veteran approached, nervously holding a folder. "I'm sorry to bother you, but Frank said you might be able to help me navigate the VA paperwork. I've been trying to get my benefits approved for 8 months now." Robert gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit down, son. Let's take a look together, and please just call me Robert. I haven't been a captain in a very long time." As they went through the paperwork, other veterans stopped by to say hello or ask questions. Robert had become something of an unofficial advocate, using the attention his story had generated to help others navigate the system that had failed him. He didn't have an office or a title. He just showed up and helped whoever needed it. David Williams, the security supervisor from that day, arrived carrying boxes of donuts. He had quit his security job and now worked full-time at the VA, using his military experience and his mistake as motivation to do better. He placed the boxes on the table and nodded at Robert. "Morning, Robert. Got your favorite. Chocolate glazed." "You're going to make me gain 50 pounds, Robert said with a smile, but he took a donut anyway. "Better than the alternative," David replied, and they both knew what he meant. Better than going hungry. Better than living in a car. Better than being invisible. The young woman who had recorded everything that day walked up, her phone in hand as always. She had started a non-profit called Seen and Served, dedicated to finding homeless veterans and connecting them with resources. The video she had taken had gone viral, reaching over 20 million views, and she had used that platform to create real change. "Robert, I wanted to show you something," she said, pulling up her phone. "Remember the man we helped last month? The one sleeping behind the library?" Robert nodded. "Of course, Tom. Marines, Gulf War. He got his apartment yesterday. He sent me this." She showed Robert a photo of a middle-aged man standing in an empty living room, tears streaming down his face, holding up a thumbs up. Robert's eyes got misty. "That's good. That's really good. That's 47 veterans we've housed in 6 months," she said proudly. 47 people who aren't sleeping in cars or under bridges anymore. And it started because someone recorded what almost happened to you. It started because people decided to care. Robert corrected gently. The video just reminded them. Colonel Thornton arrived, moving slower these days, but still determined. He and Robert had become close friends again, meeting for breakfast every Sunday at Tony's Diner, where both men ate for free now. The colonel sat down with a grateful sigh. "Getting old is not for the weak," he joked. "Tell me about it," Robert agreed. "Did you hear the city council approved the funding?" Colonel Thornton asked. "The new Veterans Resource Center. They're breaking ground next month." Robert had heard, but it still felt surreal. The center would provide housing assistance, job training, mental health services, and a place for veterans to gather. The mayor had kept his promise, pushing the project through despite budget concerns. Public pressure, driven largely by Robert's story, had made it impossible to ignore. "They want to name it after you," Colonel Thornton added casually. "Absolutely not," Robert said firmly. "If they're going to name it after anyone, name it after the ones who didn't make it home. Name it after your buddies, my buddies, all the names on that memorial wall. Not me. I told them you'd say that," the colonel smiled. "So they're compromising. The Robert Chen Memorial Veterans Resource Center, dedicated to all who served." Robert started to protest again, but Morrison's daughter appeared, as if summoned. She had become a regular at these gatherings, honoring her father's memory by helping other veterans. "Let them do this, Robert," she said softly. "My father would have wanted it. Not because you're special, but because your story opened eyes. It made people see what they'd been ignoring. That matters." Robert looked around at all the faces, old and young, all connected by service and sacrifice. He thought about where he had been 6 months ago, sleeping in his car, eating 1 meal a day if he was lucky, feeling forgotten by the country he had served. And now this. All these people, all this change, all because he had tried to attend a ceremony. "You know what the funny thing is?" Robert said quietly. "I was just trying to pay my respects that day. I wasn't looking for help. I wasn't trying to make a statement. I just wanted to be around other veterans to remember. Sometimes the most important things happen when we're not trying to make them happen," Frank said, joining the conversation. "You being there, being who you are, it was enough. The rest of us just needed to wake up and see it." The businessman who had given Robert the apartment stopped by on his morning jog. He did this often now, checking in, making sure Robert had everything he needed. "Morning, everyone. Robert, the heater working okay in your place?" "Perfect. Thank you again." "Stop thanking me," the businessman said. "You've already thanked me 100 times. We're good." But Robert would never stop thanking people. That was who he was. A man who had given everything and felt grateful when anything was given back. The mayor arrived, less polished than usual, wearing casual clothes instead of a suit. He had started attending these gatherings too, not for photo opportunities, but to listen, to learn, to remember why he had gotten into public service in the first place. "Robert," he said, "I wanted you to know. The state is looking at what we did here. They're considering a statewide program based on our model. Other cities are reaching out, asking how we turned things around so quickly." "It's not about speed," Robert said. "It's about commitment, about following through. Words are easy. Actions take work. I'm learning that," the mayor admitted. "Thanks to you." David approached with a young man in tow, someone who looked lost and scared. "Robert, this is Kevin. Just got back from his 3rd deployment. He's struggling with the transition. I thought maybe you could talk to him." Robert stood up and offered his hand to Kevin. "Come sit with us. You're not alone in this." As they talked, as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, as more veterans arrived and more stories were shared, something profound had settled over Memorial Plaza. It had become what it was always supposed to be. Not just a place to remember the past, but a place to support the present. Not just a memorial, but a community. The young woman raised her phone and took a photo of the gathering. Robert noticed and shook his head at her. "What?" she said defensively. "This is beautiful. People need to see this." "Just make sure they see more than me," Robert said. "Show them Frank and David and everyone here. Show them what's possible when people decide to care." She smiled and nodded. "Deal." As the morning went on, as conversations flowed and plans were made and lives were slowly rebuilt, Robert sat back and watched. A year ago, he had been at his lowest point, alone and forgotten. Now he was surrounded by people who cared, who were doing the work, who were making sure that what happened to him wouldn't happen to others. Colonel Thornton leaned over and spoke quietly. "You did good, Robert. Not just in the war. Here, now, you reminded us all what matters." Robert shook his head. "I didn't do anything. Everyone else did the work. You showed up," the colonel said simply. "Sometimes that's all it takes. You showed up and you let people see you. That was enough. Maybe it was. Maybe being seen, being acknowledged, being valued was the beginning of everything else. Maybe that one moment at the Veterans Day ceremony, as painful and embarrassing as it had been, was exactly what needed to happen." Robert looked at the memorial wall across the plaza, at all those names carved in stone. Brothers and sisters who had given everything. He thought about them often, wondered what they would think of all this. He liked to believe they would approve. Not because he was special, but because their sacrifice meant something, because people were remembering, because veterans were being cared for, because no one was being forgotten anymore. At least not in this city. Not on Robert's watch. Not while he was still standing, still showing up, still reminding people that every veteran matters, every single one.